The theater of the mind is eternal. The little man who used to come into the marketplace and sit there and tell the story, that's still the same thing. It's the little boy climbing up on Daddy's lap and saying, Daddy, tell me a story. Essentially, I'm still doing that, Woody. But I have to give it the contemporary electronic gimmickry, shall I call it, that makes it immediate now. And we're doing that.
Well, I got fired by Himan Brown.
You did?
Yeah. I got rehired on other things, but I was doing what they called a hitchhike, which took place at midnight, and it had to do with, the network and local stations dropping off, and but it had to be done at 12 o'clock on Saturday night, and it was for Dream Shampoo. And it was really kind of a tedious job, because as I say, I was living in Connecticut, and sometimes if I didn't have anything to do on a Saturday, I'd come in just to do that. Or if we had been in town, and Frank had been working, because he usually worked Saturday nights, then we'd go to Hurley's Bar and Grill, which was called The Beach, and we'd spend a lot of time there, and I would have to get upstairs to do the shampoo commercial. Well, I had been doing it for over a year, and I just went in one night, and I knew the copy by heart, practically, and he threw the cue, and I did the pitch beforehand, and I wound up by saying, so be sure and try Droom Champagne. And it wasn't one of those things where the audience would say, did I hear that right? I said it loud and clear. And after he pushed the talk back, and he said, sweetheart, I think you've been doing this too long. I'll get somebody else. And he did. But I did. I said it brilliantly.
By the time the CBS Radio Mystery Theater debuted in 1974, the men and women associated with the show had been involved with each other for nearly 40 years. Mary Jane Higby grew up in Los Angeles and remembered Hollywood before it was a radio hub.
I was brought up in Hollywood because my father was an actor, and he went out there for D.W. Griffith in films. And I went through public school in Hollywood. And yes, that's a long time ago. Yeah. And when I was just out of high school and playing in the theater out there in the stock company, and someone saw me and asked me if I wanted to do a radio show, and I sure did, because it was the Depression. You see, radio was, as we knew it then, that type of radio, was the entertainment form of the stay-at-home days of the Depression and the gas ration days of the Second World War.
Hollywood was not the center for radio in the early 30s when you were working there.
No, it certainly wasn't, because there was no... the telephone wires were not set up in a way that made it easy to broadcast from west to east, what they called the round robin, which I never understood or knew anything about till I started writing the book. And then I went to an engineer at NBC and said, look, why did it cost Eddie Cantor $1,200 more to broadcast from Hollywood than it did from New York? Because I'd found this out during research. And he said, well, it was the round robin, dear. And then he explained to me that is the skein of telephone wires which form the network. Now, I had been speaking over those networks for like 30 years then, and I didn't know it. I think I had the idea that everything I said went right straight up to the roof and out and into the homes across the nation. I'd never really thought of it. But, of course, I knew the telephone company had something to do with it, but I didn't realize the extent that the important part it played. And it was in 1937 that they learned to reverse the channels so that they could broadcast directly from the coast. And then there was a great rush of shows from New York to Hollywood. Unfortunately, it was the year I selected to go from Hollywood to New York, but that has been the pattern of my whole life experience.
She was once called Queen of the Soaps.
It was the first broadcast I did of When a Girl Marries, and I was extremely nervous because I wanted that job desperately. It was the first contract I ever had, and it meant an enormous amount to me because it meant a security I knew about. I had been secure in the past 5 years, but I never knew it, because every week you were thinking, now, will I be called again next week? But I always was. But now I would have a contract with my name on it and somebody else's name on it, and I would be permanently engaged. So I was shaking all over. And Ken McGregor had made a strong fight to put me on the show against someone in the advertising agency who just happened not to like me or my work. He didn't know me personally. And I had finally achieved this, so I was terribly nervous, and I had a suit jacket on with a large belt buckle, and I sat down in a folding chair and kept my nose buried in that script and worked every second. I was keyed up to the nth degree. Then when I tried to get up, I found that I was tied to the chair, this belt buckle. I couldn't figure out what it was. My icy fingers wouldn't disentangle me. And I saw the panicky look on the announcer's face because he'd ended his narration. And the sound man rushed over to me, and he realized he couldn't get me out of this position, so he just picked up this chair and carried the chair over to the microphone and held it.
What did they view?
Well, and somebody else, I guess the announcer came around. It was Frank Gallup then. Frank came around, and they worked together and got the buckle out and finally took the chair away. And I played that whole scene with someone holding a chair up against my seat.
But fortunately, you didn't, or no one saw the humor in it at that particular moment, so you were able to maintain your composure, right?
It was a terrifying thing. It was just dreadful. It was the longest broadcast of my whole life.
Mary Jane, you were certainly considered the queen of the soap opera when you were in the radio broadcasting medium, weren't you?
Well, I think there are several girls that would dispute that, and I don't want to find poison in my tea in the morning. No, I would think that Ann Elsner as Stella Dallas was a strong contender for the title, and Julie Stevens as Helen Trent came in very strong. I will say, and also our gal Sunday, Vivian Smolin. But I will say that When a Girl Marries did hold the highest rating for 5 consecutive years. It was during the war years. We went on at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on NBC. And it was a very popular time and a very popular show during that period. It lasted 18 years.
I believe, yes, until about 1959.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. And I guess you were on all but one network. You were with NBC, ABC, and CBS with that particular show.
With that particular show. I played on all the networks in other shows, you see, because we all did 6 or 7 a day.
Joan Banks, who later married Frank Lovejoy, remembered the New York hangouts.
But you see, those days, we didn't have the kind of arrangement we have now. There was the show and the repeat. So that if you did a daytime show and you were on at 10 o'clock in the morning, then you had to repeat for the West Coast 3 hours later. So Kaufman's drugstore was very big for coffee, and Colby's was great for us gin rummy players in between shows. The sad end of that was that if you did a show at night that went from 10 to 11, let's say, then you had to stay, no matter where you lived, and we were living in Connecticut, which was quite a long commute at that point, and we had to stay until 1 o'clock and get off the air at 2 o'clock to do the show for the West Coast. So the hours, were kind of weird when you were doing the nighttime stuff. But during the day, work, as you all know, no matter what any of us does, work begets work. And those of us that were in at the beginning of commercial radio as it finally, evolved, we all were learning our business, and we all got pretty good at it, and the more experience we got, the more in demand we were. So I don't know you could call that cliquish, but I would say pretty much the same people worked over and over again. It was very hard, for instance, for a Broadway actor to come over and compete with the skilled radio people because the technique was different, and they didn't quite catch on to it.
There she spent time with men and women, like the oft-heavy Larry Haines.
Well, I tell you, it's a funny thing, Dick. In each medium, they look for different things. Physically, no one ever thought of me as a heavy on stage. I do play a heavy in a visual medium, namely motion pictures, and the film that's about to come out, which I'll tell you about later. But it had been difficult for me to impress upon people that I played heavies in radio, and they looked at me and said, "No, come on now, you're much too cherubic." And so I made a transition from playing heavies to doing comedy, which I always loved doing anyway, and I still do. And I played some of it in radio, and now I'm known as a light comedian in theater. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was easy to work with a voice. You knew this vocal quality, and so you said, "Well, let's have Larry Haines."
Give me a Larry Haines type if you can't get Larry Haines.
Well, that was always, give me a Frank Lovejoy or give me someone else. But there was a period where they never thought of me for anything but heavies, even in radio, until the latter part of my career in radio, and I made the transition to romantic leads, and Nobody believed I could do it until I proved I could.
Did you change your vocal quality when you did heavies? Suppose you were doing one now. Would you talk somewhat differently than you did?
Well, you just gruff them up a little bit, and you make them a little more guttural and less polished, and you got a heavy. Yeah. You want to play romantic, you can talk like that.
Soften up a little bit.
These men and women were usually overbooked.
I tell you, it really was a young person's business, because if you can picture, NBC was in the RCA building, which is at 50th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues. And at that time, CBS was at 485 Madison, which was at 52nd Street and Madison Avenue. So if you were lucky enough to do a show and finish a show at NBC and you had a rehearsal for something at CBS, you really had to have your track shoes on. And if you had a conflict, in other words, if they started without you, which they sometimes did, then you had to really fly.
What about holding the elevator?
Oh, yes, you'd sometimes have to have the elevators hold.
We'd run
so
like
that the instant we were, finished with whatever we did, they would take us downstairs and we wouldn't have to stop, for the regular stops. It was, as I say, you had to be young.
Joan Banks went to the West Coast in 1948.
Well, most of the people that came to California pre-television activity were usually actors who had gotten an important screen role and were here for many months and got to like the climate and that. They didn't come out here to leave New York because New York wasn't productive. It was. But they, came out here and fell in love with it. The great egress of so many people was later on, when New York started to really falter in terms of production. And then, whether they wanted to or not, a lot of people came out because there was more work out here.
All right, now both of you came out here, in the late 40s, was it?
We came out in 48.
48. And you worked a lot of radio out of Hollywood, too.
Well, yes, and I did, things that I had heard in New York that I thought were just absolutely wonderful, like Lux Radio Theater. I mean, to be out here and be able to be on Lux Radio Theater was just the biggest thing that ever happened to it. But television was beginning to make inroads. I did work on Playhouse 90, and I did work on, these were live, as you probably remember, and I did work on Robert Montgomery Presents. The transition was beginning, and I was lucky enough to be working in both mediums. I used to do one Perry Mason a year, that was another. Gail Patrick knew I loved to do heavy, so she'd always make me the murderer. But eventually, the television shows were no longer being done by DuPont. They were being done by the networks, and it finally got to be more television than radio.
It was about that time that TV came into the picture. E.G. Marshall was part of it from the start.
I was a pioneer in television. I was on the first dramatic show that was done on the network, and it was an NBC network. It is Our Town. Fred Coe was the director. He was a pioneer in television. Raymond Massey, Dora Morandi. At that time, it was an open end because we couldn't time the shows as well. If you'd go in between the time segment, for instance, we would go off the air at 10:10, well, to fill up that 5 minutes, there'd be a standby pianist or someone like that there just to fill in the remaining 5 minutes. That went on for quite a while because we didn't know how many sets there were. Well, we knew how many sets there were, but we didn't know how many listeners there were because nobody cared that much about television. They were listening to their radios.
That's right.
And then after a while,
this was what, 1946, 47, somewhere
around in there, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before radio began to decline, as Joe Julian remembered.
In your opinion, when did radio begin to decline?
As television began to ascend.
You have much of a chance to go into television, as many of your peers did at that time.
I did the first dramatic show that CBS ever did.
You were a real pioneer in every sense of the word.
Yeah, it was a 12-minute thing. There was only one stationary camera. You couldn't move it to follow the actors, It was almost like a stage production. Yeah. I think it was the late 40s. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I remember there were only about 200 experimental television sets in the city at that time. They were programming these things experimentally, And I remember the director took us over to his house afterwards, and there was a fight on television. It was a championship fight of some kind. I forget who was fighting. But the only way you could tell the difference between the two boxers was one had white shorts and the other had dark shorts. The images were so unclear.
Yeah, this had to go back probably to the late 30s, I would think. That would seem to me late 40s would...
No, it came back. It was right after I came back from England, which was in 1942. Mm-hmm. Oh, I said late 40s. Yeah, I was wrong. Yes, you're right about that.
Well, at any rate, you did make it successfully over into television. You're very much a part of the television scene today. And what part do you play on Somerset, the daytime NBC soap?
I play Vic Kirby, kind of a mysterious, interesting handyman figure who could be up to no good or not.
But nearly 20 years later, thanks to Himan Brown, CBS was back in the radio drama business in 1974.
You've been associated for a very long time with radio drama. Don't you think its day is over? Don't you want pictures?
Hardly. The pictures are right in your head, Woody. I make better pictures with your mind and your imagination than any camera can make with the actuality. What's important is that the words themselves take on a meaning which is not encumbered by faces or by backgrounds. The words paint the picture, and those words you hear. You listen to those words and create your own pictures.
Well, I'll be. Where did he go? I don't know. He just vanished, disappeared into thin air.